Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. This is Joshua Lee, and on behalf of the Public Contracting Institute, I'd like to welcome you all to today's session of GovCon 101, covering Contractor Purchasing System reviews, joined by our expert instructor, Lana Ray. Before we jump in, I do have some housekeeping announcements and reminders. If you are new to our GovCon 101 sessions, make sure you are tuned in, listening closely. If you're seeking credit, you must stay till the end and complete those knowledge checks. There will be no passwords in this session, but again, if you are seeking credit, please make sure you stick it through till the end to complete those polling questions. If you have any questions, comments, or anything you'd like to communicate, you can send them through the questions panel that is at the top right of your GoToWebinar window. We do appreciate questions. You can submit questions at any time, but questions will mostly be handled at the conclusion of the slides. A copy of the materials can be located under the Paperclip tab. And with that, if you have any technical difficulties, make sure you let me know. I want to make sure you have a smooth experience. Thank you so much for joining, and I will hand it over to Lana.
Great, thank you, Joshua. So, happy Monday to everyone. Nothing like starting off a great week with a little bit of chat about the Contractor Purchasing System review. As she said, please put any questions you may have along the way in the chat box. However, I'm going to wait towards the end of our session to answer the questions so I can be as attentive to what we have in front of us at the moment as we go through. All right, let's get started. GovCon 101, talking about the CPSR. That's me. I'm a senior manager at Forbes Mazars. I'm a former Air Force contracting officer. Did that for quite a while, retired from the Air Force, and then worked in industry at a defense contractor. And I was in charge of all of the business systems for government contract compliance. And so I had the fortune to be able to negotiate with about 20 DCMA auditors on a daily basis based upon whatever business system they were looking at, or DCMA as we would do with a CPSR. And I was having so much fun with that I figured I would share the wealth and just I don't know, maybe mix things up a little bit, I guess you can say, and became a consultant. And so I've been doing that for about 6 years now. So I'm really happy to be able to share some of my information that I've garnered over the years, a little bit of experience and knowledge, and hopefully point you in the right direction in this journey towards knowing about CPSRs. Here's our learning objectives. We're going to identify events that trigger DCMA CPSRs. So we're going to focus primarily on Department of Defense contract requirements, okay? Assess the policies and practices for topics examined by DCMA. We're going to identify areas requiring cross-functional involvement. Who besides a subcontracts or procurement person needs to be involved and aware of all the requirements and help you to make sure your system, your purchasing system, is compliant. And then how do we prepare and plan for a CPSR? So let's start with a quick overview. First of all, the CPSR is a review of a contractor's purchasing system performed by the government. So remembering that a system is not just an ERP, okay? It's not, Deltec or CostPoint or whatever type of, Infor. There's all sorts of different ERPs. It's not that. It's not the ones and zeros that you manage and enter data into and get that data out of, but rather it is a system of records. It's a system of policies and procedures, practices, various lines of authority, training, internal reviews. That all becomes a system. All of the activities that are involved, from starting with an identification of a requirement through the order, receipt, and payment of that requirement. Okay, And remembering that CPSR are only for those procurements that are directly charged to government contracts or upper tier subcontracts. So essentially, our appropriated funds given to us by Congress that funnel down through the federal agency that you're awarded a contract to or an upper tier subcontract to, and then in order to perform whatever you're going to be providing to the government, whether it's a product or a service, that funding is subject to these rules. Okay, that's the appropriated funds element. And so anything that is directly charged is subject to CPSR with some exceptions. And we'll go over those in a little bit. So what's the purpose? Why does the government subject our companies to these CPSR? Well, they want to evaluate the efficiency and effectiveness with which the contractor spends government funds and complies with government policy when subcontracting. Honestly, what I like to say is, are we spending our tax dollars appropriately? Are we doing the best we can with the funds provided to us from Congress? Are we efficient? Are we effective? So that's the test that we have to be presented with and prove that we're doing well. And who are the evaluators? Generally, it's the CPSR analysts from DCMA. There are other people out there for other agencies, for instance, the Department of Energy. They have a team built of industry and government that does their CPSR equivalents, which are called PERTs, P-E-R-T, kind of a fun name, huh? And then there are other situations where maybe the contracting officer, the procuring contracting officer, or the ACO themselves may take a look at your system, at your products, at your policies and procedures to make sure that you're in compliance with CPSR. Okie dokie. So what are those events that trigger DCMA's CPSRs? Past performance. Has the recorded past performance that your company is being graded on in performance of their contracts, does it speak well to how you're using the appropriated funds for subcontracting or delegating responsibilities of performance to lower tier subcontractors, suppliers, vendors, whatever? Is that going well? So that may be one of the elements of past performance that you're graded on. And if it's not going so well, then that may trigger a CPSR. Also, the subcontract volume, how many subcontracts you do, the complexity of those subcontracts, and the dollar value as well are triggers that may invite a little bit more examination to your system. If they see that there are some opportunities for a CPSR, they're going to look at the sales to the government that you have received during the past and also over the next 12 months. If you're expected to exceed $25 million per the FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulation, you may be subject to CPSR. But the DFARS, the DoD supplement to the FAR, has that threshold at $50 million. But please don't hang your hat on the $50 million, okay? Because we have seen in the past where, because of the first two elements, past performance and subcontract volume, complexity, and dollar value, that potentially you may be targeted for a CPSR, even if you aren't selling to the government or anticipated to sell $50 million worth of contracts. Okay? So it's just a guideline, I will say. This includes prime contracts, subcontracts under government prime contracts, and their modifications. So even if you haven't received a recent new prime contract or are not expected to receive a new one, but you have potentially modifications or maybe an upper tier subcontract under a prime contract that is large and is otherwise qualified, some of these may trigger that CPSR. All of these dollar values exclude a few things though. So if you have any competitively awarded firm fixed price or fixed price economic price adjustment contracts, take those off of the table. Additionally, the FAR Part 12 commercial awards, which are generally seen on the standard form 1449, where on the front page of your contract it actually says at the top commercial, then those are also excluded from this dollar value. So if you primarily are performing under firm fixed price or commercial FAR Part 12 awards, then most likely you are not going to be targeted for a CPSR until your portfolio changes. Okay, roles and responsibilities. So who's all involved in this? First of all, we have the contracting officer. The contracting officer title may include your administrative contracting officer, your corporate administrative contracting officer, your divisional ACO, or your procuring or procurement CO. So that's the person that actually awards you something with a dollar value, okay, the PCO. So they are tasked with performing surveillance activities once a year. You may have seen where the ACO provides a sheet with all sorts of questions on it, like how many awards did you get from the government, from which agencies, for what dollar values, and what contract types. And then there's some other information, and it may include a last year, current year, and future year value that they want you to provide. They will also potentially ask for maybe 5 subcontracts that you've written so they can do a quick top level assessment to make sure that you're doing things correctly and that you know what a CPSR requirements are. And that's essentially their risk assessment between those two elements. And then through that information, they'll decide if a CPSR is needed. If it is, they contact DCMA and their CPSR team to get one scheduled. But it's the CPSR analysts who work for DCMA that perform the review. Once they perform the review, they prepare a report and they review the effectiveness of the corrective actions if there were any that needed to be done. They will also report weaknesses or make recommendations to the ACO based upon what they saw during their review. So that's the CPSR analysts. They're the ones that actually perform the review and do the reporting afterwards. However, only contracting officers can approve or disapprove your system. So they actually have to be a warranted contracting officer with that responsibility. Generally, it's an ACO that will do it, maybe a DACO or a CACO. But if your system is approved, the contracting officer will continue to perform surveillance activities and determine if you need that review to happen again in another 3 years. Now, if disapproved, the CO will request corrective actions, and they will continue to essentially what I would call work with you to make sure that you're going in the right direction, implementing corrective actions, and being able to provide evidence of those corrective actions being placed in practice. Okay, so that's the roles and responsibilities. But why do we go through this? Well, if you can get an approved CPSR, which that's why we're here, right? We want to find out what the requirements are. First of all, it's going to relieve your consent and notification requirements for subcontracts. If any of you have had to quote unquote deal with consent or notification requirements, it's quite arduous. You have to plan for days in advance of notifying or requesting essentially approval or consent of an anticipated subcontract prior to award. So sometimes we say add another 7 to 10 days for that process. And the documentation is also quite arduous as far as making sure you do the request or the notification properly. You record that information. If there's any further questions or responses that need to be conveyed to the CO, that documentation needs to be kept, and you need to have evidence of it for a future CPSR. Now, that's something you have to go through quite a bit if you do not have an approved purchasing system. If you do have an approved purchasing system, there may be some consent and notification requirements still required, but it's at a much smaller threshold. Okay, it's the documentation is less, the timeline goes faster because the contracting officer already has an assurance that you know what you're doing. Now, the big one that we find senior leadership very concerned about is withholds. So if one of your 6 business systems is disapproved, that institutes almost automatically, not automatically, but almost automatically, a 5% withhold. What does that mean? That means every time you invoice for something that you've delivered, you withhold 5%, and the government essentially gives you or pays you 95% of your invoice. So it really puts a strain on the cash basis for the company. So keeping that in mind, when senior leadership is saying, we don't need all this contractor purchasing system documentation, you're just slowing everything down. A little bit of a reminder that if we're not doing it right the first time, and in the event of getting a disapproved system, that we're essentially going to be losing out on 5% of your cash right away. And that's, let me clarify, that's cash on cost type contracts, okay? Not your firm fixed price or your time and material contracts, but your cost type contracts. And then additionally, if you get a second disapproved business system, it could go all the way up to 10%. Ouch, right? That's a lot of cash that isn't flowing through until you get that disapproval turned and it becomes approved. Then you get to get that cash back. So the government's just penalizing you for a little while, but eventually it'll all work out with a lot of hard work. And then there is something about a competitive advantage in source selections. More and more we are seeing, especially on the large GSA, multiple award, IDIQ type contracts, that they are analyzing and essentially providing more points or a better review if you have an approved purchasing system. Okay, so when you are competing against other companies, to have an approved purchasing system actually puts you in a better position for winning that bid. So here's a couple of examples of a solicitation section L from the government that shows a little bit about how the CPSR affects the scoring when you are putting a proposal in to the government. So the first 2 essentially say that if you have a purchasing system that's approved, then you either advance to the next phase, or maybe you get more points. The second one says you get 200 points. That one, the second one here, L5211, you'll see that the purchasing system must have been approved by DCMA or another federal agency. Now, the third one we're seeing a little bit more over the past, I'd say 5 or 6 years, is that there's an alternate route, especially this is great for smaller companies, or medium-sized companies that may not hit that threshold, or the ACO hasn't determined that you need a CPSR to be done by DCMA, but rather you essentially contract with an external CPA to do a review of your purchasing system, just as if they were DCMA. They're going to use a DCMA Contractor Purchasing System Review Guidebook to do this. And after they do their review, they will they'll evaluate, and they will either say that you're acceptable or not acceptable based upon the standards within that guidebook. It's a very interesting approach for it to be done by a CPA, in my opinion, but that's what they're asking for lately. All right. So moving on then, we see that some of the regulations plus the guidebook at the bottom that guide and that direct the elements that are reviewed during a CPSR include FAR 44.3, which is titled Contractors Purchasing System Reviews. And the 44.303 goes into the extent of review. And of course, then it references someplace else. It references FAR 44.202-2, considerations. So all of those are elements that will be reviewed. Then we go a little bit further in where the clause that you need to worry about is FAR 52.244-2, subcontracts. This clause tells us that the government reserves the right to review the contractor's purchasing system. When this clause is in your contract, and more often than not, it is in your contract, then if you are a defense contractor and it's a DoD awarding, or an agency under the DoD that's awarding your contract, then if 52.244-2 is in your contract, so shall DFARS 252.244-7001 be in your contract. This is the kicker. Paragraph C lists 24 elements that the purchasing system shall comply with. And we're going to go over those in a little bit. But this is really what directs the government to look into your system if it hits that lovely $50 million threshold or is close to it, okay? So as you see, besides for the 24 elements under the 7001, we have a guidebook. Now this guidebook is, in my opinion, outdated because September 2021, there were some changes made, but a lot of the direction within the guidebook still relies upon thresholds or terminology or rules back from 2018 to 2021, okay? So it does, though, provide the 30 major purchasing areas that are reviewed. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this because in the guidebook, it provides guidance and procedures for DCMA to follow, the analysts to follow, and it's essentially a guidebook that you can use to figure out what DCMA is going to look at and how they're going to look at it, okay? So it's very important to become familiar with it. There is rumor that they are updating it, but as you know, our new administration may be making significant changes to the FAR and DFARS as well. So I have a feeling they're holding off on issuing an update until they figure out what's going on with our current FAR. Okay. So we're going to assess the policies and practices and also identify areas requiring cross-functional involvement next. And here we go with these policies and procedures. As you can see, DFARS 252.244-7001, paragraph C, mentions policies and procedures and practices in all sorts of paragraphs. 1, 6, 17, 18, 19, 22, 23, and 24 gives direction to the government to review your policies and procedures. And additionally, in the guidebook, it essentially tells the analyst to look at the policies and procedures for all 30 elements. That's a lot, right? You'll say, but I don't even qualify for some of those things. For instance, small business subcontracting plan, or maybe you don't have a situation where the excess pass through would even take place. That doesn't matter. They still want policies and procedures. Okay. So even if there's a topic that really doesn't affect or is not conducive to your business at this time, you still need to address all the topics that are listed in the guidebook. And remembering that the policies and procedures provide the foundation for practice assessment, in other words, for when they open up a file and review it, you need to be able to say in the policy, not just a policy statement. Don't limit your policy and procedures based upon, well, if I don't tell the government how I'm going to do it, then they can't evaluate whether I did it how I said I was going to do it. Yes, they are actually going to look for how you're going to do it. And if you don't have that listed in your policies and procedures, then they're going to mark it down. It's amazing how robust your policies and procedures really need to be to comply with the CPSR standards. You need to have the why, what, who, when, and how in there for each topic. A little bit of a hint, we have seen some CPSR analysts really, really, really dig in on making sure all the clauses that may be governing how you do something or why you do something, make sure those are listed in your policies and procedures. If there's a prescription, in other words, what part of the FAR governs that clause, include that as well. If there's any public law references that may be within the clause, maybe within the FAR, maybe determining how you have to approach a certain situation, and I'll just pull off the top of my head, DPAS, 15 CFR 700, the Code of Federal Regulations, which is a regulation, of course, but make sure that 15 CFR 700 is referenced appropriately when you're talking about Defense Priority and Utilization Act, okay? So we need the public law references and the various thresholds to also be listed in your policies and procedures. So, like I'm saying, they need to be pretty robust. Now, one of the big topics that they look at is training. Because without training, how do you know if your folks are going to execute their subcontracts properly? Or how do they know how to execute a subcontract properly? How do they know what the CPSR standards are? Making sure that you're holding regularly scheduled procurement training is important. If you haven't been doing it, starting now, especially with the training you're taking right now, document that you've taken this training, and that helps satisfy part of the training requirements for CPSR. Make sure you focus on topics that are associated with CPSRs, develop and execute to a plan. And it doesn't have to be super complex. It can be more of a guidance, but actually doing it and documenting that you've been training and that you have some type of plan is very important. But don't forget to take advantage of documenting those annual conflict of interest gifts and gratuities trainings that your company probably does across the board. Make sure that you document that that's part of your CPSR training, because guess what? Ethics and kickbacks are part of the CPSR. And I mentioned earlier that we have some cross-functional applicability. So throughout your company, training is an element that these various functions may become involved in, right? Legal, ethics, human resources. Perhaps your training manager helps with either scheduling the training or tracking the training in everybody's personnel records. And external trainers. If you need to call a consultant like myself or somebody else that does training professionally, then that's a great way to get the training that you need for your folks as well. Internal audits and self-reviews. How do we know that we're doing well without looking at what we're doing, right? And do we know what right looks like? Those are a couple of things that really test the waters on a CPSR or in preparation for a CPSR. If you don't have an internal audit function that understands purchasing systems and maybe the ISO, like ISO 9000 or 9001, those types of internal audit functions, they can help out with top level reviews as well. Making sure that you review your policies and practices to make sure they're consistent, compliant, and repeatable. That's an important element during your self-reviews. Excuse me. Going from a purchase requisition to the PO or a subcontract, to receipt of the goods or services, to invoicing, all the way to closeout. It's really from cradle to grave that a review or an internal audit of both your policies and how you execute is very important. And oh my gosh, we didn't do it if we didn't document it, right? So make sure you document those compliance reviews. This adds value to the whole process. I like to use external mock CPSRs to check compliance. Even when I was in charge of government compliance for my company, I would do internal reviews quarterly, but then about once a year or so, especially if maybe I didn't have funding for once a year, but especially about 6 to 12 months before an actual CPSR coming up, I would make sure that I had someone come in externally and do a mock CPSR to see how we were doing. Because looking at your own products isn't as effective as somebody from outside looking at it with an eye to what's going on currently. How are the CPSR analysts behaving as far as, are they really picky? Do they have a certain viewpoint? Does your policies and procedures make sense to a newcomer or an outsider? All those fun types of elements are very important and really can be done well through a mock CPSR. And of course, cross-functional again. The people that might be involved in internal audits or self-reviews would be internal audit, compliance, if you have a compliance department or an individual in charge of compliance, quality, and maybe even external consultants, right? So it takes a village, is what I like to say. There's not just you in charge of one thing trying to make sure all elements are satisfied, but rather engage that village to help. Okay, and let's move on. Procurement, sourcing, and pricing. This is mentioned over and over and over and over again when we're talking about CPSR criteria. As you can see, I have listed all sorts of paragraphs and statements, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 21, and 22, where it talks about sourcing. It talks about fair and reasonable pricing. It talks about cost or price analysis or single sole source, all sorts of things, right? How did you find potential sources? How did you document after you've solicited and received their proposals? Did you evaluate for price, fair, and reasonableness, responsibility. Did you make sure that you sought discounts? There's all sorts of fun things that you get to go through and also document. So these elements include the source selection. Did you compete? Was it a lowest price technically acceptable or a best value situation? Or did you justify a sole source, right? If it was a sole source, did you use one of the reasons under FAR Part 6 in order to justify that sole source? Price analysis. Required for all. You're like, wait a second, what about those purchases that are below the micro purchase threshold? We don't have to do a price analysis. Unfortunately, you need to be able to say that the price that we paid was fair and reasonable, regardless of the value. How do we do that? Well, for micro purchase threshold purchases, in other words, those under 10,000, the buyer probably has knowledge of the market, and so they can make an informed decision as to whether the price that they're going to pay for the product or the service is fair and reasonable. Now, if you do a competition for a smaller purchase, then it is very similar to any value, right? You do a competition, you select the lowest price technically acceptable. That's great. Document, keep on going along your way. If it's a best value, maybe a technical trade-off, then you need to document why you did not go with the lowest price. So even for those small ones, there's still the process of a price analysis. It may just be very simple. Regardless, you need to document the technique that you used. And I love to say, show your work, just like we had to in grade school and high school and the such. Show your work utilizing one of the techniques under FAR 15.404-1B2. And then we're going to negotiate. If you are purchasing something on a sole source basis, guess what? The DCMA's CPSR analysts say that you need to negotiate. They expect it for every single sole source action. It's not just, well, they're the only source, so therefore I had to pay that much. Nope, they want you to negotiate everything. So remember that, okay? That's a tip that I'm giving you today, that if you have a sole source, negotiate. This may be a simple email exchange back and forth asking for a discount. It may be, look, you need to give us a bulk discount, or maybe I've looked at your pricing or your costs and you should be able to come down in this area. Attempt negotiations, document that attempt. If you're successfully attempting, or if you're successful in your negotiation, make sure you document who said what, how, when, where, why, and how, okay? So making sure that the documentation is there for all sole source actions is really critical to a successful CPSR. There are some guidelines in the FAR, DFARS, and the CPRG. CPRG, okay, that is a pricing guide. It has 5 volumes, and you can find the reference in 15.404. It is a work of art, we'll just say, that the government relies upon still. It was done quite a while ago, probably even 20 or more years ago, I think. But it was done through Air Force Institute of Technology and other elements in the Air Force to put together some type of guide for how to source, how to price, document, how to negotiate profit, analyze a cost analysis, proposal, all sorts of fun things. And so the CPRG is a great resource for providing ideas and methodologies for doing especially a cost analysis. So don't bother to reinvent the wheel. It's all there. Just use the guidelines that you can find in the FAR, DFARS, and the CPRG. And you may need help with these, right? So business development, program management, and engineering come into play when we have an analysis, whether it is a price analysis, maybe we need to justify our source selection, and we need to negotiate based on a basis of estimate. Those cross-functional personnel can really be helpful when we're analyzing and documenting the decision that we've made. All right, procurement awards. Knowing that in 4 different areas, this clause mentions flow down clauses, terms and conditions, the proper type of contract selection, all those fun things. Those are just some of the terms that are used in these 4 criteria. So remembering that it's important that those are in your policies and procedures and in the practice, right? So in order to do this, we need to know our contract. If you're a subcontract manager and the contracts manager's director of contracts does not share the prime contract with you, and you don't know what the flow downs are for that specific prime contract, ask for that prime contract, okay? Interestingly enough, DCMA will look specifically at your commercial awards, and if you have excessive flow downs in there, they're going to write you up, okay? So sometimes we can stick self-deleting clauses in, and we'll say, oh, if this doesn't apply, then consider it deleted. Unfortunately, we don't get to do that with cost accounting standards. Under FAR 52.230-6, paragraph L, it essentially says that you shouldn't use or you will not use self-deleting statements. Okay, so don't flow down any 52.230-1 through 6 clauses unless your procurement has cost accounting standards and is applicable. Okay. The next one is DFARS 252.244-7000. Within this clause, I think it was the winter of 2023, maybe like November, they changed it to where it says for subcontracts for commercial products or commercial services, you shall only flow the clauses within 52.244-6, which has a list of commercial clauses, or 52.212-5, paragraph E, which also has a list of commercial clauses, and no other FAR clauses will be listed. Okay? Make sure you skinny down those clause lists for commercial products and commercial services. And the same with the DFARS clauses, you have to only use, in other words, you have to do some analysis and make sure that you're only flowing down DFARS clauses that are actually applicable to that product or that service. It takes a little bit more work than it used to, but keep in mind, the more clauses, the more expensive. Who wants to read through all those clauses? Who wants to take into consideration all the work that the clauses that you have in your procurement may generate? So if you can skinny down the clauses to exactly what is needed, what is required, then you're going to be in a better shape to negotiate better terms and better pricing. Okay, so our cross-functional elements here, because legal may be a great help with figuring out which clauses do I keep, which clauses do I not keep. Can we put together a list of clauses that are, multifunctional across various purchases? That's great. Legal's great at doing that. So is contracts management. And then, of course, compliance. Depending upon your company, those are the 3 cross-functional elements that may be very helpful to follow your requirements under a CPSR for flow down clauses, terms and conditions, and contract type. Okey-dokey. Next, we have a lot of statutory or regulatory requirements. Again, DFARS, all those lovely criteria. Gosh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of them, 9 different paragraphs. Mention that you're going to have policies and procedures and procure things in light of these various requirements. And those requirements are certified cost of pricing data, cost accounting standards. Now, those two come into play at $2 million or greater, just off the top of your head. So if you haven't hit that threshold on your procurement, you may not need to worry about those first two. Prior consent and advance notification thresholds are all over the place depending upon your approval status, like we talked about, of your CPSR. Small business subcontracting plans. That one comes into play at $750,000 if your company is a large business. And if you are subcontracting to a large business. Okay? So if you're subcontracting to a small business, then small business subcontracting plans are exempted automatically. Debarred or suspended contractors. They've just recently adjusted the terminology for this. So when you get a chance, look this up. 52.209-6 has a new title. They added some more words onto it because it wasn't complicated enough to say in the first place. But paragraph C makes sure that we get a certification that our subcontractors are not debarred or suspended. That's at $35,000. The payments to influence, anti-lobbying, that kicks in at $150,000. Defense priorities and allocation system. You probably know this. That kicks in at $125,000, but it could be lower. I have plenty of companies that say, well, hey, if I don't put the DPAS in there that's flowing down from the prime contract, then I'm not going to get my delivery on time. I just know this company. Or I just know the way these products, the demand form, I need to put my DPAS on there at a lower dollar threshold. That is fine. Federal Funding and Accountability and Transparency Act, FFATA. So that's where we report our subcontracts over $30,000. Those are very interesting because we just switched that system over to GSA. So if you have been using FPRS to enter those in, I think it was last month or maybe it's this month, this reporting was just switched to, not GSA, I apologize, SAM.gov, to SAM.gov. And then excessive pass-through charges. For the most part, there's some ifs, ands, whats, or buts on this one, but for the most part, it's a $2 million threshold. Okay, so cross-functional, again, this is finance, legal, contracts, and business development. All right, there is a lot of statutory requirements throughout here. So what does that mean? That means if it's statutory, guess what? In the new administration, there are rules about reducing the FAR down to only things that are statutory, means most of these requirements will stick around. So if you thought maybe a smaller FAR would get rid of all these crazy things, no, sorry. A lot of this will still continue to be the bane of our existence in some parts. All right, documentation. Again, documentation is a tough one, right? Oh, I know how to do that. I can do that. Of course, it's fair and reasonable, and I'm not going to tell you how I got there, but just, trust me, I did the right thing. Unfortunately, like I said earlier, if you didn't document it, you didn't do it. That's pretty much what I've experienced with CPSR analysts and their thought pattern. All right. Even if I come up with the right answer, if I didn't document how I got there, they're not going to give me credit for it. It's really like school, huh? So the amount of documentation that you need to have in your files, though, depends on the threshold, the type, and the complexity. Making sure that your files are organized and self-contained is really important. So checklists are very helpful. Always having, like back in the good old days, we had 6-part folders or 2-part folders where you could always find the various pieces of paper or the types of documents in the same place. Now, with everything being online, you could have an online folder structure. You can have a software that's specifically set up for tracking your accomplishment of your procurements. Regardless, making sure that everything is consistently organized and that any document that is associated with that procurement is in that file is very important. Because when CPSR comes and the analyst says, okay, I want these 40 files, you want to be able to just essentially gather up those 40 files and pass them on over. And you want the CPSR analyst to be able to click through all the documents as quickly as possible without hunting and pecking and searching and getting frustrated. You want to keep them happy, okay? So it also is something to remember that if, say, we used to say you got hit by a Mack truck, but that's not a nice way to say it. So say you win the lottery and you are leaving the company and now somebody's going to take over your work. You really want to be the good person and make sure that they can figure out what you've done, where you are in the process, and where everything is stored, right? So think about that when you're doing your file work and you are creating your documents, you're organizing and you're filing everything. That if tomorrow you don't show up to work because you've won the lottery, that people aren't going to be cursing your name. They're going to be able to find everything so simply, and they're going to be saying, oh yeah, no problem, I'll take over. Interestingly enough, when you get a CPSR, if you haven't documented something, they can say you've essentially have a problem in documentation. But if that documentation, say for instance, is on your purchase requisitions or your negotiations or your modifications or even closeout documentation, those are separate areas of evaluation that you can get another hit on. And then let me just add beyond the double hit. If your policies and procedures don't describe the type of documentation and what to do with that documentation on any of those areas, oh yes, it could be a third hit. Okay, so make sure all those elements have some type of documentation requirements. How are you going to document it? Do you have a special form? Is there a notation you make for certain types of procurements? Whatever it is, and then make sure you do it. Make sure the practice of that documentation proves that you have been documenting as appropriate. And again, cross-functional here, program management, finance, and engineering. Sometimes that is the hardest thing, is to get those folks. That might be their requirement. They might be helping you negotiate. Maybe they're doing an evaluation for your source selection. They need to be able to document and send that request or send that evaluation to you. But you'll need them to document what they've done or analyzed or what their opinion is as well. So truly a cross-functional team effort on this. Supply chain management. Here's some areas within supply chain management that we put all together because Unfortunately, it's not just about you. If you're a procurement professional or a subcontracts administrator or whatever, you're not the only one that is working with a vendor rating system. Yes, you need to make sure that you use responsible, and reliable sources, and that you know that oversight, surveillance, and evaluation has been done on these vendors or suppliers, however you want to call them. Making sure also that the system states that you're going to address quality, delivery, performance issues, etc., as they arise. All right, so those are some of the elements of the vendor rating system. But it's not just you as the subcontracts administrator doing this. It is a team effort. Sometimes you have a separate supply chain management group, or you have a program manager or project manager. Maybe there's quality person involved. Receiving, did they receive the parts appropriately? However it is, making sure that they assist and are timely in their documentation in the vendor rating system is important. Very similar to that is the contractor counterfeit electronic part detection and avoidance system. Again, another system within a system, right? So you have your CPSR, which is a purchasing system. You have your vendor rating system, and another evaluation that's done under the CPSR is the counterfeit electronic part detection and avoidance system. Generally, it just falls under the CPSR because we want to make sure that we are procuring parts that are not counterfeit. Of course, it can be really catastrophic if we do get electronic parts in some of our weapon systems. However, it may take program management, quality, receiving, whomever, to make sure that they have all the pieces and parts in place for that system. So work with them to make sure that that system is running well, if it's applicable to what your company does. Cybersecurity, this is a hot topic. I wouldn't doubt that eventually this will be completely separate from the CPSR, but right now in 252.244-7001, it is still a hot topic. DCMA CPSR team has been targeted to include this in their evaluation. They do have IT folks from DCMA that do the actual evaluation, and then they incorporate those results in. So if you have any further questions about that, I can expand upon it later, or we have folks that are quite adept at the lovely CMMC things that are coming down the pipe, but stay tuned for more. And then, like I've been saying, cross-functional. You need your program management, quality receiving, information technology folks all on board, because all of these are systems within systems, okay? These are evaluated separately and included in the CPSR report. So how do we prepare and plan for a CPSR? You know, I get a lot of clients that say, oh, we have a CPSR coming up in 6 months, or I'm putting in a proposal to GSA and I'll get more points if I can get a CPA to say, hey, we satisfy all the requirements and our system's acceptable. And then, 6 months isn't going to cut it, right? To get the policies and procedures, to start the practice, to have a full year worth of documented files, it's going to take 1 to 2 years at least prior to the actual CPSR. Okay, so think way out in front. And it might be difficult to sell, but do your best. You can come to us if you need help selling that. Yes, I need a year or two of dedicated work in order to make sure that we are ready to pass and to get an approved purchasing system. Making sure you document and track any corrective actions. So if you identify something that needs to be corrected, Now, document it. Start implementing that corrective action and track it to completion. Even if we'll say you have a CPSR coming up in 3 months or 6 months, and you all of a sudden realize, oh, we haven't been reporting FFATA. Goodness gracious. Start now, document it, show that you've been doing it, that you identified it, and generally, not always, but generally the CPSR analyst will understand and say that you have implemented it. You might still get a write-up, but you can show that your corrective action has been implemented and that it's flowing smoothly. Very important. Make sure you review and update your policies and procedures with the hints that I gave you earlier. Step up those compliance reviews. Take a look at the pre-award actions, even before solicitation or before or post price analysis, when the source selection's been made before the award is done. Take a look at the documentation. Take a look at the reasoning. Is it in line with what a CPSR analyst would anticipate or expect to be seen? If you can do some pre-award reviews, then you catch the documentation that needs to be updated or enhanced prior to award, which is really important. Okay? And if you find any weaknesses or maybe regulations have recently changed, focus training on those. And that'll be very helpful in preparing for a CPSR. And when we train, we document, right? So the types of CPSR could be an initial or comprehensive. So the first one is generally comprehensive, but you've never been through one, they're going to understand that you might need a little more hand-holding or explanation as you go. But then every 3 years generally thereafter, after your initial, sometimes it's even to the same month. Like say you got one 3 years ago in September, guess what? This year in September, you're going to get another one. That's how you can essentially plan for them. Or if you had a lot of findings or problems, you might get a special or a follow-up by the CPSR group. And those are initiated by DCMA rather than by the CO. Okay. The scheduling is coordinated between the contracting officer, the CPSR analyst at DCMA, and you, the contractor. So if there is a problem with the timeline that they are targeting, bring it up. They're not always going to listen to you. They might demand that they do it, the last week of September during end of year. But you can ask for either something sooner or later. And if they can, generally they will reschedule, but it has to be for a good reason. The CPSR analyst generally will start requesting information somewhere between 90 to 120 days prior. They'll ask for the policies and procedures, questionnaire, and then a 12-month purchase order universe. In other words, all the actions you've performed over the past 12 months, they'll select a sample from that. During the CPSR, and I know I'm getting into our question and answer time, but I'm just going to wrap this up really quickly. But during the CPSR, remembering the analyst has already reviewed and evaluated, for instance, your policies and procedures and the questionnaire and such. So they have a foundation of what they're going to be seeing. They'll do an entrance briefing. Then they're going to select those probably about 40 files and they'll review those. Okay. Generally, they'll give you a super quick turn for delivery on those. Be prepared. Generally 2 to 3 days, sometimes less. Sometimes you can ask for more time, but not often is that received very well. Anytime they have a question on a file or anything else, they'll ask you via email and demand that you respond within 24 hours. They like to hold briefings daily just to kind of go over the status of everything. And then you'll get a final exit briefing at the end of the 2 weeks. So afterwards, they issue a level 2 corrective action request within 3 business days. That's if you have any problems in your files or in your policies and procedures, any things that they have identified that needs to be corrected. So this is a very critical point. Making sure you initiate a corrective action plan on all elements that have been identified. The corrective actions should include policies and procedures, the training you've been doing, and the objective evidence. What is objective evidence? Essentially, it's proof through your file reviews or through your execution of the documentation, or maybe a better price analysis or a source selection document, showing that with an actual procurement that you have put into place that corrective action. So responding within 30 days with the corrective action plan and evidence of the corrective actions taken is definitely critical to success here. They'll review the CAP, then they'll notate the results in the CPSR report. If they're satisfied with all your corrections, good on you. The level 2 car is closed. If not, they're going to escalate everything to the ACO. In 10 days, the ACO issues the final determination as approved if no material weaknesses exist. However, if one or more still exist, the ACO issues an initial determination. If they do that, the corrective action cycle continues, and you have 15 to 30 days to respond. The ACO has 30 days to evaluate, and again, it keeps on going over and over and over again until everything's resolved. So again, critical is jumping on the corrective action plan. Even if during the 2-week CPSR, something is identified as not being right, you say, oh yeah, we need to fix that. Start your corrective action plan then. Start your corrective actions. Get that objective evidence going even before you see the final report. Because improvement and change is great. They're going to appreciate your effort to really move forward on that. So some of the tips for success, like we're talking about, perform a gap analysis, kind of like a mock CPSR. If you know or suspect a CPSR is in your future, get on it, work through it. Use internal or external reviewers and look for expert advice, like you have here, on recent trends. What have CPSR analysts been doing? For instance, looking for public law and regulatory references within your policies and procedures. Develop corrective action plans. Make sure those cover policies and procedures and forms, training. Make sure you get any type of evidence or proof of those results in your procurement files, and document what has been done, where your successes are. And then update your team on changes to regulation. Remembering change is constant, and we expect before the end of this calendar year to have quite a bit change going on, right? The federal acquisition regulation is in a state of flux going forward. Right now, what we see, what's in writing, is still applicable though. Okay, so follow it and be cognizant of where we are in this process. Making sure you train and educate your folks, invest in them. They're doing a lot of hard work for you, and you want to invest in their future as well. All right, so we have some questions. Joshua, are you helping with this, or do I go on?
Yep, I'll go ahead and read the first knowledge check. Make sure you are submitting an answer if you're seeking credit. Knowledge check number 1. Who decides if a contractor will be scheduled for a CPSR? I'll give you guys 30 seconds for that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. Looks like we
So the proper answer there was C, contracting officer.
Question number 2. Who approves or disapproves a contractor's purchasing system? Give you guys a few more seconds. All right, I'm going to close that.
All right, correct answer is contracting officer.
Number 3, does a compliant contractor's purchasing system depend solely on the purchasing department? All right, I'll go ahead and close that.
And that's correct. No, it's not dependent only on the purchasing department. Last one.
Final question, what are the attributes of good procurement files? I'm going to go ahead and read those just in case they cut off on the poll. A, documentation depends upon award value, contract type, and complexity. B, consistently organized and self-contained. C, contains a complete and accurate history of purchase transaction. Or D, all of the above. All right, I'm going to close that poll. And we've got 97% selecting D.
That's correct. Excellent. So I see just a couple of questions that I can provide a response to. One of them was our firm fixed price LOE, in other words, level of effort, also excluded from CPSRs. And no, unfortunately, they are not. And I say unfortunately because they're one of the more complex contract types to have to execute under and track. Let's see. If we have multiple subsidiaries that have individual cage codes, if we triggered a CPSR, would it be just that individual subsidiary that hit the threshold, or would it be all companies and subsidiaries under our parent company? That's a great question. This is where really paying attention to what subsidiary is identified or what cage codes are identified in the ACO's letters and notification or request to the DCMA CPSR analyst. So if the ACO is focused on one or a few or all of the cage codes, that is what the CPSR is going to be on. I've had the situation where I had a company that had 6 cage codes. Only 4 were targeted for CPSR. So that's what we focused on, was just that 4. And that is all that will be evaluated. So hopefully that helps with that question. Find out what the ACO is targeting for that cage code and limit your universe and your responses and all of your data provided to those cage codes. Lana Del Rey, yes, I know. She stole my name. Thank you. Let me see if there's any others really quick. I think that's about it. One more really quick. Regarding FFATA, how often do we need to obtain that information if it's with a vendor that we use frequently for different subcontracting? Can we keep a copy on file for a period of time? So I believe they are talking here about the executive compensation for a subcontractor or a vendor. Fortunately, now that we're using sam.gov, we're not needing to track as many of the executive compensation for each vendor, because if they are registered in SAM, it flows directly to any entry we do. Otherwise, award over 30,000 shall be reported in the month after the award, regardless of how often. So just keep that in mind. Hopefully that's helpful. And I wish everybody a wonderful week. Thank you for bearing with me for the past hour and a quarter, and enjoy.
Thanks so much, Lana. As always, we'd love to know how we did today. All feedback is greatly appreciated. If you have any additional questions, feel free to send them through. We're more than happy to follow up. If not, I wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. We will have a lot of upcoming programs, so make sure you check out PCI's website. A recording will be sent out usually a day after the session. Make sure you complete that survey under our account or our website under your certificate account so you can get your certificate. If you have any questions, feel free to send them through. If not, I wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. Thank you all, and thanks, Lana.
Thank you.